Welcome back, Troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. Today we're going to learn about a 1980 Gibson model that nearly nobody knows about, the Baby 25 50th Anniversary guitar, better known as the Gibson Les Paul SM. So this is a really unique model that was only made in 1980 at the Gibson Kalamazoo plant, and there is very little information out there. In fact, the only knowledge source about these guitars online actually comes from a Les Paul forum post from 2003 about a guy who tells his tale of talking to Gibson about his guitar that he purchased in 1984. And he asked them some very key questions about these things. How many were made, and what on earth does SM stand for? Okay, so first off, SM apparently stands for solid mahogany. There was the KM standing for Kalamazoo, Michigan, so it's kind of like a brother to that 1979 exclusive guitar. There were some of those made in 1980 as well. So it's kind of a brother to that model in a sense, but what on earth does solid mahogany mean? Is it a solid mahogany guitar, kind of like a 50s Les Paul Custom? No. It's not. It still has a maple top to this. And heck, even look at your neck here. It's a three-piece maple neck because we're in the maple neck era. Why they call it solid mahogany, pretty much the only thing that anybody can think of is it's not a pancake body anymore. But I really hate that explanation because 1980, the pancake body was well done for about 4 years. It's 1976 when that kind of phases back to the solid mahogany. But if you're unlucky, you can find them all the way until 79. So perhaps this was the model that they did to commemorate that they're no longer ever going to do a pancake body ever again. But who knows, maybe that one guy saying solid mahogany is what it means is just making stuff up and we will never know the true answer. So how many of these guitars were made? That post says 2,000. I highly doubt that because this is a guitar most people have not heard of. You can search for these things online and you only find photos of like 3 or 4 of these things that constantly show up. This poor road dog's been passed around so many times. Every single reverb sale documented for an SM is this particular guitar except for one other one. So in my opinion, I would guess less than even 500. I mean, not many of these have shown up. But you can find them in 3 distinct finishes. You can kind of get them in black. Like if you look at it this way, it kind of looks like a black one. I think that's a pretty cool finish. A wine red like this one has to be my least favorite option out of all of them, but unfortunately it was the only one I could find. And the coolest one, Silverburst. That's right, just throw Silverburst on this weird SM. But what makes this guitar special? Why should collectors today in 2020 and beyond care about this thing? Well, it's a kind of a cool limited edition blend model. So there's models like the 2550, the Artist, the Artisan, the Les Paul. There were a bunch of really cool limited edition guitars, and this one takes all those elements and blends it all into one guitar. So I call it the Baby 2550 because of the obvious. It has the stock coil split switch right here. So this is not something that somebody added later on. It is stock from the factory, and it has the same 2550 style pickups. They're the Series 7 tarbacks. But what does it borrow from the Artist? Did you miss it earlier? It's got this weird tummy cut. Now, it's not the exact same, but it's kind of, along the same lines of the Les Paul Artist in the fact that it has multiply custom binding on the front, but no binding on the back due to that comfort cut. But it kind of blends some other fancy elements of the other guitars, including the 2550 and Artist, in the fact that it has a TP6 tailpiece. And take a look up here, we have a brass nut. If only they would have did a brass truss rod cover, it just would have had so many fancy features, but unfortunately it's just plastic on this one. But there's one more spec that's kind of the elephant in the room. Take a look at our fretboard here. It's kind of like a dot neck ES335. You've got binding along the edges, it's just single ply, but you have mother of pearl dot inlays. Now you could say that this was like an experimental prototype model of what eventually came out in 1983 called the Studio Custom. It had multiply binding on the top, it did not have the comfort cut, but it didn't have binding on the back. So some reputable sources actually call this a prototype model for the Studio. I don't agree with just a regular Studio. I think that's pretty much the Gibson Sonics at this point in time. However, I would agree that this could potentially be a prototype for the Studio Custom. So that's a quick crash course on everything that I know about the Gibson Les Paul SM. It's such an obscure 1980 model, most people have never heard of it, but let's go ahead and throw this thing on the workbench and learn a little bit more and take a look at its parts and specs. Alright, inside the Les Paul SM, the mysterious thing nobody has ever seen inside one of these unless they've owned one. So this actually gave me the shock of my life. These are not the exact same pickups as in a 25 50th anniversary Les Paul. They are, and at first glance you're going to be like, yep, you've got the double leads coming out of here, so these are indeed the Series 7 Super Humbuckers. But it wasn't until I got into the inside control cavity that I actually saw how they're vastly different. Look at that, you've got the regular shielded braided wire, but then you have an insulated plastic one. And they likely did that to make it easier for the guys installing it to know which one's the coil split lead, because normally it's just a whole mess of braided wires in there. So that's one way to know if somebody's taken the SM pickups and put it in a 2550, swapped out your pole pieces and whatnot in the cover, but honestly, you really can't get the covers off of these things, so you'd likely never run into that situation anyways. But that was a great little obscure factoid to find. But your bridge pickup reads 15.8 k ohms in the circuit. You can split that down to 8.16, so that means down is split and up is regular. So our neck pickup, it's about the same, 15.93. You can split that once again for 8.23. And the middle position split is about 4, and then regular, it's going to be what, around 8? Yeah, 7.93. Now, I personally am not a huge fan of coil split Series 7 pickups. It's just kind of a sign of the times. This was very new, early, primitive technology. But for sake of full disclosure, something's went on with the pickup ring. I think the string's kind of rubbed against it. But at least this one's looking pretty good. As far as the bridge goes on this model, it's your standard Nashville style with the studs within the body. However, this bridge has actually been replaced. This is a modern day one branded PW. An original one would say made in Germany on the side right here. But honestly, an original 70s bridge, they're very cheap to replace. But a cool little thing for this guy is it gets a stock TP6 tailpiece in chrome. You can see that the fine tuners have definitely taken some wear, but this is original to the guitar and was pretty much only reserved for high-end instruments. Now, unfortunately, our switch tip has been replaced. It likely got damaged in shipping. I mean, this one's kind of been passed around quite a few times. I'm guessing it's just because, you know, people want to try it because it's a rare model, but then they decide it's not necessarily for them. This is a very beefy guitar, and despite polishing it, you can tell there's a lot of wear and tear, nicks and dings on the top. Somebody loved playing this thing. The knobs have been left alone, thankfully, though. You've got your vintage speed knobs that have aged beautifully. And underneath our pickguard, as normal, you can see a little indentation right there. And the pickguard itself is multi-ply, kind of like a Les Paul Custom here. But before we move on here, yes, it does indeed have a maple top, and then it joins onto a mahogany body. You can see that join line right at the bottom right there. I was curious if SM had something to do with like a larger body, because it does feel huge, but it still measures the regular 2 inches. And I'm not quite sure what went on here. It's like somebody filed down the binding a little bit too much. I wonder if that's why this one was marked a factory second. But due to the way that the finish has been disturbed, that was likely done for a reason. But moving on from our body, we can move on to our neck. So once again, it is a 3-piece maple neck with an ebony fretboard. There are some sources out there that incorrectly state rosewood. Maybe the one example that they had rosewood. I mean, there's not a lot of documentation out there, but all the ones that I've seen have indeed had this ebony fretboard that is bound like a Les Paul standard and has dot inlays for whatever reason. Now, if you're curious what these little splotches are, apparently that's some sort of a filler. As you can kind of see some indentations right here because somebody's fingernails was rubbing against it and eventually caused that groove. So somebody's went ahead and filled that in. It just kind of looks like there's oil on your fretboard, but it is 100% smooth. Probably a good thing they did that. Now, in my opinion, these frets look a little bit taller than what normally came on the Les Paul at this era. So maybe that had something to do with it. Super mumbo frets. But this thing has never been refretted, but it does appear it was a gigging machine because the neck has expanded and contracted, and that's kind of caused some damage around the binding because the fret's trying to sprout. But thankfully, it hasn't cracked off anywhere. Now, has this ever been refretted? I don't believe so. Despite most of these fret nibs being really tiny or cracked off, you can still see some up here where they just had tiny fret nibs. That's going for that 24 3/4 inch scale length. We've got a wide 1.7 inch nut width, which increases to 2.05 by the 12th. Now, as far as the first fret neck depth, it says 0.78, but this is a really rounded neck profile. I mean, it gets super beefy up here, 0.1. And hey, check out our cool brass nut. That's a nice little stock feature on high-end Gibsons of the day. And here's our headstock. Notice it does not say Les Paul model on here, but it does say Les Paul on the truss rod cover, Les Paul SM. And here you can see your truss rod and a maple neck. Now moving on to the back, quite the interesting little Les Paul here. Obviously the biggest feature of this guy is this really strange, awkward comfort cut. Even the Les Paul artist had something a little bit more deep than that. So I don't know what good that's doing. It just seemed to catch that guy's belt buckle, because you see that pretty much all around this guitar. You got some nicks and dings. The Blacklight Test will definitely help show all that stuff off. But back here you have the 2550 channel route. For whatever reason they decided to use it on this guitar too. But we have untouched electronics in here dating to 1980, the 13th week. And it looks like maybe the 11th week on these other tone pots. But here you can see what I was talking about with those pickups. This is the first place I saw it. I was like, what? What's going on here? What are all these gray insulated things? They're going to the coil split switch, whereas the traditional braided ones are going there. So yes, it was a pain in the butt for the people wiring up the 2550s. It uses the same backplate. You even get the shielding tin apparatus here. But we've got a regular strap button down here. You've got a metal output jack here, and your second strap button on this side. Thick binding in the cutaway on that one, and here is our neck. Again, 3 pieces maple. Unfortunately, this one, it's been completely worn through. It's smooth. I mean, you can feel a very slight difference right here, but I think as far as a playability thing, you're going to be just fine. It's just kind of a visual eyesore. I would be more worried about this light impression that honestly, you don't even feel that, but it is there. So it starts off really small, but super rounded, and then it gets chunky and rounded. It's unlike most neck profiles that I've ever had from the Norland era of Gibson. I would still classify it as 60s, but it's super rounded, almost kind of like a 50s, kind of a tweener neck. And all this other stuff. But take a look at that very characteristic Kalamazoo built guitar giant volute of the late 70s and early 80s. It's just a sight to behold. And hey, Grover tuners, stock from the factory, just like the Les Paul KM. And also like those, again, made in Kalamazoo because it's under 500 there. And this one dates it to the 147th day of 1980. And it is a factory second, for whatever reason. It's been long gone by now with all this other wear and tear on this particular example. Oh, and don't worry, it's a chunky Norland. 11.5 pounds. Jeez. 11 pounds, 8.1 ounces. Well, it took me 9 months to film this episode of having this guitar, but hey, it's done. Let's go ahead, plug it in, and hear how this thing sounds. Now that we know everything about the Gibson SM, what are my final thoughts on this thing? Should everybody rush out and go buy one of these things? No, they're obscure for a reason. Just holding this guitar in my hands, I didn't think I was going to like playing this thing, but once I kicked some distortion on, I was impressed with some of the tones you could get out of this thing. There's a reason why this one was played so much. So, 2550s. I love the look of them, but I've never really loved the Series 7 pickups. Typically because that coil split tone's always really ice picky. But in this guitar, it's the other way around. The humbucker sounds are so dark, it sounds like you're trying to do like jazzy, roll your tone off type tones, but all this demo had the tones on 10. But the coil split setting really kind of made this a nice spanky guitar, so I mean, it's kind of an interesting one, not necessarily one for everyone, but definitely check one out if you happen to see one out in the wild. On top of all that, this is a really heavy guitar, so if you sit down and play a lot, you'll probably like it better. However, if you're standing up and trying to gig this thing, it's gonna get heavy on you. So a cool, obscure piece of Norlin era history, but not necessarily the best value for your money. Because how much do these things cost? You normally see them anywhere between like $18,000 to $3,000 depending on condition. So there's a lot of guitars that you can buy within that. So if you're a collector, probably worth picking one of these up just to have something strange in your collection. But if you can only buy one guitar, just pass on the SM. So let's go ahead and check this out under Blacklight before we say goodbye. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of looking forward to this because these super player models, they usually have really cool glowing, and you can kind of tell the history behind these. So you get a little bit of edge wear right here in the lacquer, but everything else, you know, for the most part, looking pretty good. Looks like a small area right there, but our knobs are glowing beautifully. No finish touch-ups on the face. Speaking of the face, let's check out the face of the headstock here. Everything's looking good there. Now you do have a little bit of stand wear. You've got a ding on the volute right there. Besides the edge wear, you're looking pretty good. And you've got lots of areas of wear on the finish here. Now again, as I was saying on the workbench, it's smooth. You don't really notice it, but it's definitely a giant visual eyesore. And honestly, I probably would have passed on this example for this if it wasn't for the fact that I got this in trade about 9 months ago. And it's just taken me this long to review it. Again, you can see the buckle rash that wore through the finish here. We'll just kind of go along the edges so you can see all these areas if you are interested in being the next owner of this one. And it appears we had some sort of large rectangular sticker on the back of this for an extended period of time. Honestly, it looks like 3 pieces of like gaff tape or something. That way it would just rub against him a little bit easier. That's what it looks like in person. But thankfully, no breaks, cracks, or repairs despite being played as heavily as this one did. As far as the case, unfortunately, this thing did have an original chainsaw case at one point in time, but some dealer in the process of trading this thing around a couple of times stole it and gave it this crappy case. So unfortunately, that's what I have for it. I mean, if you really want a vintage correct case and want to pay additional for it, I can put one in, but it's not the original case. So you got 1, 2, 3 latches on this one, as well as a back latch. It's just a generic cheapy little case here, nothing too fancy. You get a little compartment in here, which doesn't hold anything of value except for your keys, and yeah, just very generic basic case. The fit is definitely not perfect, so I'll put some additional padding in here that you're welcome to keep in there. If you think it might be interested in being the next owner of this Les Paul SM, you can check out that link in the description, which will take you to the Reverb for sale page, or you can contact me directly on my website, troglysguitarshow.com. Thank you, Troglodytes, for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed getting to learn about this weird, obscure model. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hey, we will see you tomorrow on the next episode. Take care.